Everybody remembers the trades. Everybody remembers the draft picks that got splashed across every timeline the second they happened. But the move that might actually decide whether Pittsburgh finally breaks through this January wasn't loud at all. It happened quietly back in June of last year, and almost nobody outside the building understood what it really meant at the time. Welcome back to Steelers Insider Now, where we dig past the headlines and find the decisions that actually matter. Today we're breaking down the one roster move Mike Tomlin made before he ever walked away from this franchise. A move that is still shaping everything Mike McCarthy is building right now in 2026. Let's set the scene first. Back in June of 2025, the Steelers made a decision that felt underwhelming to a lot of fans at the time. There was no big press conference. There was no dramatic reveal. Tomlin simply got a deal done to bring in a veteran quarterback who a lot of analysts assumed was already past his prime. That quarterback was Aaron Rodgers. And while the rest of the league was busy talking about flashier additions around the NFL that offseason, nobody was talking about Pittsburgh. That silence is exactly the point of this video. Because sometimes the moves that change a franchise don't come with fireworks. They come with patience. Here's what people forget. Tomlin didn't have a long list of options at quarterback that offseason. The front office had gone years without solving that position, and the pressure inside the building was enormous. Instead of panicking and reaching for a flashy short-term fix, Tomlin waited out a slow negotiation and landed a four-time MVP, who still had something to prove. It wasn't the kind of move that trends on social media for more than a day, but it was the kind of move that buys a franchise time to build around a real foundation. And that's exactly what happened next season. Rodgers led Pittsburgh to a 10-win, 7-loss record and shocked plenty of people around the league by delivering the franchise its first AFC North title since the 2020 season. Think about that for a second. A quarterback move that barely made a ripple when it happened turned into the single biggest reason the Steelers were relevant again in January. But here's where the story turns, because winning the division wasn't enough. Pittsburgh still hadn't won a playoff game since the 2016 season, and that drought followed the team right into the postseason. The Steelers ran into a buzzsaw against Houston in the wild card round, and the loss was ugly enough that it changed the entire direction of the franchise. One day after that blowout, Tomlin resigned. 19 seasons, 193 wins, 2 Super Bowl appearances across his tenure. All of it ended not with a firing, but with a coach walking away on his own terms, because both sides quietly understood a change was overdue. This is the turning point of the whole story, and it's the part most breakdowns skip right past. Tomlin's exit wasn't really about talent anymore. It was about the fact that Pittsburgh kept building solid 10-win rosters without ever taking the next step. And the frustrating truth is that the quiet Rodgers move he made just months earlier was actually the best personnel decision he'd made in years. He just wasn't going to be the one who got to finish what he started. So now the obvious question: what happens to that decision once the coach who made it is gone? This is where a lot of franchises would have blown the whole thing up. New coach, new quarterback, new identity. That's the easy narrative. Instead, Mike McCarthy walked into the building and did something that tells you everything about how much value that quiet 2025 signing still holds. He kept Rodgers. Not only did he keep him, he reunited with a quarterback he already won a Super Bowl with back in Green Bay. Rodgers is genuinely familiar with McCarthy's system, and that system is built to be quarterback-friendly in a way that last year's offense simply wasn't. Think about what that actually means for this season. Under the previous offensive scheme, Rodgers was stuck in a dink-and-dunk approach that rarely pushed the ball down the field. The middle of the field barely got used. Big play weapons barely got the ball in space. Now picture that same quarterback dropped into a system he already has 2 MVP seasons of experience running. That's not a small adjustment. That's potentially the difference between a first-round exit and a real playoff run. And McCarthy didn't stop at just plugging Rodgers back into a comfortable scheme. The front office went out and gave him actual weapons this time. Pittsburgh traded for Michael Pittman to work the intermediate routes that opens up everything else on the field. They paired him with DK Metcalf, who can already take the top off any defense. Add in a rookie slot presence taken in the second round, And suddenly Rodgers has exactly the kind of receiver room he never had last season. None of this works nearly as well if the quarterback isn't already comfortable and already bought in. That comfort traces directly back to a contract signed quietly more than a year ago. The backfield tells a similar story. Jaylen Warren proved last season he could handle a starting workload, and the front office paired him with Rico Dowdle to form one of the more underrated 1-2 punches in the league. Add a tight end room where Darnell Washington has turned into a legitimate matchup problem alongside a steady veteran presence, and you start to see a roster that isn't relying on one single star to carry everything. It's a group built with balance in mind. And balance is usually what separates teams that survive one round in the playoffs from teams that make a real push. Now let's talk about the part of this roster that still worries people. The defense took a real step back last season, ranking near the bottom of the league against the pass and near the bottom in total defense as well. The one thing that saved that unit was an aggressive knack for takeaways, which kept Pittsburgh competitive even when the underlying numbers were ugly. That's not something you can bank on repeating year after year. If this defense doesn't bounce back at least partially, none of the quiet quarterback continuity or the flashy new weapons will matter much once the games get tighter in December and January. Here's the second turning point worth sitting with. The offensive line went through a real transformation this offseason, with new pieces added specifically to protect the investment at quarterback. When a franchise spends draft capital reshaping the trenches around an established passer, that's usually a signal of exactly how much confidence ownership has in the plan already in place. It's another quiet thread tying back to that original decision from over a year ago. Everything McCarthy has done since arriving reads like a coach protecting and building around a piece he didn't even have to go find himself. It was already sitting there waiting. Let's zoom out for a second because context matters here. Pittsburgh spent the final stretch of the Tomlin era stuck in a frustrating cycle. The team was consistently solid enough to avoid a true rebuild, yet never talented enough to seriously threaten in the postseason. Year after year, the front office refused to tear things down completely, and year after year, the roster landed somewhere in the middle of the pack. That cycle is exactly why so much criticism landed on Tomlin even in years where the record looked respectable on paper. Solid was no longer good enough for a fan base that remembered championship rosters. What makes the Rodgers signing so interesting in hindsight is that it broke that cycle without anyone fully realizing it in the moment. It wasn't framed as a bold swing. It was framed almost as a compromise, since the market simply didn't offer better alternatives at the position. Yet compromises sometimes end up being exactly the right move once you look back on them with full context. A four-time MVP willing to sign with a team still searching for direction gave Pittsburgh a floor at quarterback that the franchise hadn't had in years. That floor is the entire reason McCarthy inherited a roster with legitimate upside instead of a total teardown project. There's also a coaching chemistry angle here that shouldn't get overlooked. Rodgers and McCarthy already share a Super Bowl together, along with multiple MVP seasons built inside the exact same system. That kind of shorthand between a quarterback and a play caller usually takes years to develop. Pittsburgh essentially skipped that entire process because of a decision made under a completely different coaching staff. Few quiet roster moves age well enough to still be paying dividends under an entirely new regime. This one is doing exactly that right now during training camp. So why does any of this matter heading into this season? Because the loudest storylines around this team right now are about a new head coach and a fresh era in Pittsburgh. But the quiet truth underneath all of it is that the single most important piece of this roster was secured before any of that change happened. Tomlin's biggest legacy move wasn't a trade or a draft class. It was refusing to panic at quarterback and landing a proven winner who is now playing in a system that actually fits him. If Pittsburgh finally breaks that playoff drought this season, the story people will remember will be about McCarthy and about a fresh start. But the real credit traces back further than that. It traces back to a quiet contract signed in June before anyone knew how the rest of the story would unfold. That's the breakdown for today. If you want more film study and roster analysis like this, make sure you're subscribed here at Steelers Insider now, because we're going to be tracking every single one of these threads all the way through training camp and into the season. Drop your take in the comments on whether this roster finally gets Pittsburgh back into the second round. See you in the next one.